Japanese is a language that belongs to the Japonic family of languages. If you couldn't tell from the name of that family alone, it is by far the most widely spoken language of this family, with the other members being way smaller in their speaking populations. There are a staggering 123 million native Japanese speakers on our planet, and of course that number only goes up when you include people who know it as a second tongue. This massive speaking population the language has resides primarily in the nation that this language originates from, Japan. The language of Japanese and the country of Japan go hand in hand with one another. Most people who live here speak it, and most written language you'll find in the country, from street signs to government documents, are written in the language's free writing systems. With all this in mind, you could easily presume that Japanese is the official language of Japan, and obviously that assumption would be completely and utterly wrong. The country of Japan does not only not have Japanese as its official language, it doesn't have an official language at all. While Japanese doesn't have official status in Japan, it does instead have de facto status. This is different to it being official. De facto languages are the ones that people use widely and are the go-to tongues in the region, but they don't technically have official status. They're pretty much official languages in all but name only, and the paperwork was never signed off. Japanese has never been made an official language in Japan because it never really needed to be. Official languages are interesting things. In most cases, they tend to have political motivation put behind them. They're usually either put in place by the people in power to help entrench an outside tongue. For example, all the languages of European origins that have official status in African nations, like French in the Ivory Coast. Or they are put in place to help protect native tongues that could be seen as dying out, like Welsh in Wales. Japanese in Japan has never really been in either of those situations. There's no massive need to officially entrench the language into the nation as it is so deeply used there now, and likewise it doesn't need the protection official status would give it, as it's clearly not in any kind of threat in Japan. This isn't the only example of the key language of a country not having official status. Australia and Mexico lack official languages too, as English and Spanish respectively are just widely used there. The US lacks one too, but that's a whole case unto itself. While these countries lack official status, they, like Japan, use these tongues as de facto languages. While Japan might not have Japanese as an official language, that doesn't mean it's unofficial across the entire globe. There's one country on our planet that does actually recognize Japanese as an official language. Obviously it isn't Japan, and neither is it any of its neighbors like China, South Korea or Vietnam, as you may logically presume. Instead, the one country to have Japanese as an official language is Palau. You know, Palau. Wait, what do you mean you've never heard of Palau? It's the tiny island country in the Pacific Ocean with a land area of just over 170 square miles and a population of around 18,000 people. Okay, so Palau might not be the most widely known of country on the planet, but what it lacks in size and people, it more than makes up for in the fact that it's the only nation on our entire planet to feature Japanese as an official language, entrenched into its laws. But even here, the language isn't official across the entire country, but rather on just the island/state of Anggwa in the nation's south. A lot of history, and of course political motivation, went into this tiny speck of a nation being the only country to officially have Japanese as a language. These two countries have an interesting relationship with one another. People from the two nations first crossed paths in a big way all the way back in 1820. It was in this year that a Japanese vessel sailing from North Japan to Tokyo got blown off track and lost at sea. After a few months at the behest of the waves, this ship finally made landfall, this being on the island of Palau. For context, Palau is around 2,000 miles away from Japan. Suffice to say, that ship got really lost. In Palau, the Japanese sailors were treated well and fair by the locals, so much so that they stayed for 4 years. This moment is seen as the start of relations between the two nations. Yet the Japanese tongue didn't take a strong hold in the land at this time. Instead, the native language of Palauan was the go-to tongue. This is a Malayo-Polynesian language which arrived on the island thousands of years ago, along with the island's first settlers. The language is closely related to tongues like Samoan, Tongan and Fijian. When these marooned Japanese sailors finally left Palau, the natives carried on living their lives as free people, though this wouldn't last forever. From here, the islands that make up modern Palau fell into the hands of various foreign powers. Eventually, Spain took notice of the islands. For centuries prior to this, they had been in control of the relatively nearby Philippines, and finally decided to expand their stronghold. This was a time in world history where European powers were hungry to grab the last remnants of unclaimed land on our planet, and Spain claimed Palau as their own in 1885. Despite this, Spain wouldn't hold on to the islands for all that long, nowhere near long enough for the Spanish tongue to to take any kind of hold in the country. By 1899, just over 10 years after claiming it, Spain let go of Palau. They didn't lose it in a bloody battle or anything like that. Instead, Palau was sold to the highest bidder. In this case, that bidder was Germany. The country purchased Palau along with other nearby islands Spain had taken control of for 16.6 million marks. That is apparently 143 million US dollars today, but another source told me they paid around $4 million for it, so who really knows. Regardless of how much they spent, the land was now under German rule. But once again, this wouldn't last for that long either, as a few decades after Germany bought Palau, the nation found itself at the epicenter of the biggest war the planet had ever faced. The First World War. This is one of the most infamous and tragic events in world history, and I'm sure we all know how exactly it ended. Germany was defeated, and as punishment for losing this war, they lost many of their territorial claims across the globe, with Palau and the other nearby islands they brought from Spain a few years prior being one of those. This, however, doesn't mean that Palau was now free of any form of outside rule, and once again allowed to rule of its own desires. The islands were instead placed in control of another outside power, the outside power in this case being an old friend. During the First World War, Japan and Germany were on opposing sides, and fighting broke out between the two nations across the islands of the Pacific. This included fighting in Palau. Here, the Japanese seized the islands from Germany, and in the aftermath of the First World War, in 1920, Palau was formally put under Japanese control, collectively with other nearby islands, and it became known as the South Sea Mandate. Unlike the previous Spanish and German rule, the Japanese proved to have a far bigger impact on life on these islands. Many Japanese people, either from Japan itself or from the wider empire Japan had been building up for itself at this point, descended onto the island and set up shop. This led to Japanese becoming much more widely spoken in Palau. Though of course this came at a price of native culture being pushed to the side, as the Japanese were seen as the ruling class on the island. This also meant that it would have been Japanese people who held roles of power and authority here too. It reached a point where Japanese expats greatly outnumbered the native population, making it even easier for the language to take hold. Japanese was on the rise and quickly becoming Palau's go-to tongue. But then the Second World War happened. A key difference between the First and Second World War was the side Japan was on. While enemies in the First World War, Japan found itself as part of the Axis powers along with Germany this time around. Palau once again became an epicenter for combat during this war, with the Battle of Peleliu taking place here in 1944 and being one of the bloodiest battles in the entire war, with thousands of lives lost. This battle pitted the Japanese against the US and resulted in an American victory. Of course, the US would not only find victory here, but be on the winning side of the entire Second World War along with the Allied powers. Germany once again on the losing side along with Japan this time. Once again, the losing side lost land and power, including Japan losing Palau. This island came under American control, and many Japanese natives who called this island home for so long travelled back to Japan. Eventually, by the 80s, the country found its independence after centuries of outside rule. With freedom came the need for Palau to write their own constitution and decide on things like what official languages of the newly formed nation should be. While at this point the Japanese hadn't ruled the roost for decades, there were still people of Japanese descent in power from that time period where they were in control. It's from here that those political motivations of official languages comes into play. These Japanese people still in power wanted their tongue to have some sway in the land, to reflect the past when they were Palau's top authorities. Each state of Palau seemed to get some say in what their official languages would be, and in the state of Anguilla, it seems the Japanese powers had the most sway, as in 1982 the Anguilla Constitution was written and declared that this specific part of the nation would have 3 official tongues. The first of those 3 being the native language of Palauan, as this language had managed to hold on despite all the outside power in this land. The second of those being English, which had become a mainstay during the country's time under American rule. And of course that third tongue was Japanese. This language was put on paper by those wishing for Palau to maintain some modicum of its time as part of the Japanese Empire, by those who still had memories of that time. Like I said, it was a very politically motivated decision. But from here, Japanese has remained as an official language of the state of Anguilla, leading to Palau being the only country in the entire world that has Japanese as an official language, something even Japan never really bothered to do. Yet while that is the language situation on paper, in reality things are quite different in Palau. If you were to visit the island today, you won't find Japanese signage all over the place, nor will you find many people actually speaking it. In the state of Anggwa and the wider country, English and Palauan are the tongues of choice. People who speak Japanese natively or as a second tongue in Palau are seemingly fairly far and few between. The country having Japanese as an official language is a remnant of a past now lost. Today, thankfully, relations between Japan and Palau are pretty good, with the two countries seemingly having a special place for one another because of their shared history. I'm sure what also helps is the fact they have fairly similar flags to one another too. What all of this does, however, is leave us with one country full to the brim with Japanese speakers, where the language has no official status, and another country where hardly anyone speaks it, but for some reason it is deemed an official tongue. Languages are really silly sometimes. Name Explain depends on viewers like yourself supporting the channel financially on Patreon, so a huge thank you to everyone who does. Donating just $1 a month helps the channel amazingly and gets you bonuses including ad-free videos, exclusive content, the power to request ideas to be made into actual Name Explain videos, and your name at the end of the video with all these awesome people. Visit patreon.com/NameExplain or click the link down below to find out how you too can support the channel. Thank you. Thanks for reaching the end of the video. Why not watch another and subscribe to keep up to date on all things Name Explain. You can find myself on Instagram where I'm NameExplainYT, and join the Facebook group Friends of Name Explain to talk with myself and other name nerds. All that will be linked down below. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video, and once again, thank you all so much.